Hello, and welcome to our Back to School webinar. I'm Amy Cook, BCBA and Community Manager, and I'm going to go over just a few things before we get started. First, you will all be eligible to earn one free CEU if you're watching this live and complete a few requirements. We're going to share 3 keywords throughout the webinar that you need to jot down. And then after the webinar, I will share an online form to complete, and you will type in those 3 keywords to confirm your participation. A recording will be sent out to all registrants. However, only live participants are eligible to earn the CEU. We also do have you can submit questions through the Q&A or in the chat, and we will hopefully have time at the end for questions. If there's something really relevant to the presentation, I'll try to keep track and share some of those with Jill as we go also. So before I hand it over to our wonderful guest speaker today, I want to share a little bit more about Hirasmus. Hirasmus is an ABA clinical software company that was inspired by our founder's son, Rasmus, who was diagnosed with autism early on in his life. Our goal is to help deliver the highest quality behavior therapy services to 1 million children with autism by helping the people who help them: behavior analysts, techs, teachers, parents, paras, clinical directors, and all of you that are here today. We provide the best clinical platform so you can keep the focus on the child in front of you. Our keyword alert, the first keyword is empower. I'm also going to put that in the chat in just a minute. And I'm now going to hand it over to our guest speaker, Dr. Jill Scher, a school psychologist and BCBAD who has led special education departments across multiple school districts throughout Texas. And we are so glad to have you here today. So thank you for being with us, Dr. Scher, and I'll let you take over now.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here today. Um, I wanted to, let me see if I've got this share. There we go. Can you see the slideshow?
I can't see it yet.
Okay, hold on. I think I hit the wrong button. Let me give it one more try. Share screen.
Okay, now I can see it, but I can see the side panel. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, there we go. See, I can do technology.
Absolutely.
So, as Amy and I were talking about this presentation, I really reflected on some of the pieces that may seem pretty foundational when we're thinking about behavior interventions and building change systems, but they can often get overlooked in planning for students, especially that are having some significant behavior challenges. So my background is both a school psychologist and a BCBA, and my passion and what has driven me is working with kids who have more significant challenging behaviors. So I've spent many years consulting with teachers and parents and working on building those systems. So what I'm going to share today are some key pieces that I think are really important when doing that consultation and building those intervention systems. So talking today a little bit about things like what we believe about behavior and consequent management. There's some fundamental pieces as far as what is reinforcement, what is punishment, that maybe there's some differences in how people understand those terms. So we'll talk a little bit about that and why it's important. And then looking at some other factors to consider when we're building those systems. Before I get into this, please feel free to put questions in the chat or ask questions. I love it when people ask questions or seek clarification. So I definitely want to encourage that. We will share spend some time at the end. Save that for some questions as well, but definitely feel free to drop those in as we're going on. When talking about change and building change systems, as I said, my background is a school psychologist, and one of those big change theories that I just love when we're talking about working with teachers and parents and classroom consultation is Prochaska's stages of change theory. I think this is such a fundamental piece of the consultation and change process because so often when we are trying to intervene, when there's challenging behavior, we jump right into that action stage. There's something that's going on. Maybe a student is engaging in some self-harm behavior, some behavior that maybe presents a danger to themselves or others. And so we jump right into that action stage. We need a plan, we make change, and we need it right now. We don't stop and step back and see where our teacher or our parent is in their readiness to change, in their understanding of the problem. And so that's where these initial stages of what Prochaska calls pre-contemplation, contemplation, and determination really come into play. And as a consultant, having a fundamental understanding of those pieces and how they play into the change process is really important. That pre-contemplation, this is the idea of, do they even recognize the problem? Whose problem do they think it is? So if we have someone who is looking at it as, this is just the child's behavior, and they're not seeing the other factors that can influence behavior, because we know there's setting events, there's antecedents, there's how we apply different consequences that can all impact a child's behavior. But the people we're working with may not understand that. And so taking time to talk through, hey, what really is their understanding of the problem? Whose problem do they see it as? How do they define it? And then that contemplation stage, that's really thinking about what is their readiness to change? Because when we're working with kids, we're really asking adults to change their behavior. We're not really asking kids to change. Kids change is our long-term goal. But when we're developing an intervention plan, we are asking typically the parents or the teachers to carry out that plan. So taking some time up front to really discuss where they are in their willingness to change their behaviors. Have they made that decision? That's that determination stage that they need to do something differently, or they're willing to do something differently in order to help change that child's behavior. All of those pieces are necessary before we jump into that action plan. So really, as we are talking with teachers, as we are developing intervention plans, making sure that we stop, we take the time to consider where people are in their readiness to change. And if they are not ready to jump into that action plan, taking time to work with them through those other stages to get them ready for action. So some of the things I'm going to talk about now are some factors that are important to discuss when we're getting ready for that action stage. One of those is what people really believe about behavior. So early on in my career, I interviewed for some jobs, and one of the discussions that came up was about the cognitive in cognitive behavior change, because some places are very behavioral. And there's not really a focus on or discussion around our thoughts and beliefs. But when we look at change, and when we look at especially asking adults who don't have a technical understanding or a training in behavior to implement what are sometimes some pretty technical interventions, their thoughts and beliefs about those interventions really do matter. If they believe that behavior is communication, then they are going to act in a very different way than if they don't believe that. And so when we use some common terms like consequences, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, is their understanding of what that word means the same as our understanding of what that word means? Making sure we're on the same page as far as desired outcomes. So when we come in as consultants to address a problem behavior, we come in with a very specific lens. We come in with our own goals for that student. And sometimes we make the assumption that the other people are on that same page for those desired outcomes, that their goals are the same as ours. So again, taking some time to have that discussion around what really is your understanding of the problem? What do you believe about what's going on with this student? And as we dig in and examining those beliefs, there are some guiding questions that I like to start with when I'm talking with teachers and parents. A fundamental understanding of how do they believe these problem behaviors have developed? Where do they believe they have come from? Because as behavior therapists, behavior interventionists, RBTs, we approach it through a behavioral lens. But there are a lot of other lenses out there that people use to understand behavior. So we often hear, well, students are doing this because they can. They know what they're doing. They're choosing this. This is a choice behavior. Sometimes kids have a trauma history. And so there's discussion around these behaviors developed based on that trauma or those experiences. And all of those factors are important to understand and discuss. So we want to ask the people we're working with, how do you believe those behaviors develop? Because we need to take that into consideration when we're designing our interventions. Because if our fundamental belief about how these behaviors developed or how these behaviors change are different from the people that we're working with, we may come at the understanding of the behavior and the interventions in a very different way. So again, asking people, what do you believe about how behaviors change? Because if people don't fundamentally believe that learning strategies work, that altering consequences or altering our antecedents work, we're going to have to spend some time giving them more information about those strategies, about our why for choosing those strategies, maybe even sharing with them some information about research or effectiveness of the strategies. Or maybe we're going to have to do some smaller interventions to try to get that buy-in. So it's important for us as consultants or supports for teachers and parents to start by asking these questions so that we know what our starting point is. If people have that same fundamental understanding that we have, then we're at a very different jumping off place than if they have different beliefs. And then giving some time for reflection. Why do you have those beliefs? Where did they come from? The thoughts that people develop over time are really important to them. And so us understanding where they've come from, how they've developed, really helps give us a foundation, a starting point for where to have discussions with, again, families and teachers about next steps. So part of building these classroom systems that promote change, looking at that change process and digging into the beliefs, we want to make sure that we talk about consequences, whether it's families or it's teachers or principals or people in the school system. Consequences is a word that comes up a lot. Typically, you will hear, well, the student just needs more consequences, or we need consequences for this behavior. When anything that happens after a behavior that impacts the likelihood that behavior will occur again is a consequence. But in our common language, that's not how most people use it. So it's common for us to start to use that word as someone from a behavioral background and think that the person we're talking to is on the same page, when in fact they have a very different meaning affiliated with that word. Rarely, when I'm talking with teachers or parents, do they start off with a behavioral definition. Again, it often means that they need more punishment, or they need to have more negative experiences. And rarely is that the case when we're talking about kids who are exhibiting challenging behaviors. So talking about that word, examining what they mean when they use that term, sharing with them what it means for us when we say it. And sometimes I actually write down these definitions to refer back to, because using a word in the common vernacular like consequences becomes such a habit for people that if we're giving them a new or different definition, they're going to default to their old definition. They're going to default to what they know. And so changing their understanding, changing what they mean, again, is part of that change process. So as we go through each of these steps, taking time to talk about it, taking time to develop a common language and a shared understanding is really important. Another factor that's important when we're talking about working with challenging behaviors is some real examination around what behaviors really mean. So when you have a student that is hitting people, that is throwing things, that is hurting themselves, those are hard behaviors to deal with. They promote a lot of fear and anxiety. And a lot of people do see that they develop because students need discipline, or they need some more negative consequences. When we approach behavior, it's that understanding of the function or purpose. And so when we say behavior serves a function, do we really explain what that means, again, for teachers and parents? So what does it mean for a student to have an unmet need? If they are acting out, it's because other methods of getting that same need might not have been effective or efficient, or they might not have that skill. But parents and teachers don't always understand what that means. So giving them some real concrete examples that they can connect with. So is there a time that you had to give a presentation and you were anxious about that? Is there a time that there was something big at work that you were really stressed out about and you thought about calling in sick? Those tangible examples that are real to people to help them think about how kids may be engaging in these behaviors for reasons other than it's just a negative behavior. So, what does an unmet need really mean? What does that look like? What does that sound like? How could adults connect with that? Because as adults, we are so far from those childhood experiences. We're so far from being in a classroom where we didn't know how to do things, where we may not yet have the skills or we may have a different perspective. So, really helping adults step back, think about that from that kid's lens, and then thinking about what it means to really have an unmet need and how we can help them get those needs met in a more appropriate manner. As with talking about consequences, it's really important when we use the terms reinforcement and punishment to give people those behavioral definitions. So often when we jump in and we start making an intervention plan, specifically reinforcement, we really talk about what's our plan. What is going to be our reinforcement system, but we don't always stop and talk about these definitions. Very often people are doing things that they think are reinforcement or punishment, but it's not actually changing behavior. If we are doing something negative because a student has engaged in a problem behavior and it's not changing the behavior, then we're just doing something negative. It's not actually a punishment because we're not decreasing the likelihood that behavior will occur again. Again, the same thing with reinforcement. Very often, parents or teachers think because I'm giving the student something that I see as positive, I'm doing a reinforcement system. When in fact, if the behavior isn't changing, then we're just giving kids stuff. And that's not going to be effective in helping behavior change. So, talking with people about these definitions, taking that time to really write them up, pulling them back out as you continue to update that behavior plan to change it is really important so that we're all on the same page with the terms that we're using. In addition to defining those behaviors and really helping to build that understanding of how they work, I think it's important to make sure that we talk through some factors that influence punishment and reinforcement. Adults very often come from the approach that just because we call something reinforcement, it is. So again, they will say, hey, I have been reinforcing this child's behavior. Well, they may have been giving the student something, but it's not of value to the student. It's not something that the student views as positive. So if you don't have friends, extra time at recess may not be a reinforcement, just like being called in from recess and not having to go may not be a punishment if that's not a successful place for you or something that you enjoy. So making sure that we understand how these interventions and these consequence strategies are really impacting students. And again, we know this as behavior professionals, but teachers and parents very often don't understand that. And so as we're talking about these strategies that we want them to use, we want to take the time to stop and say, hey, it sounds like you're calling this a reinforcer, but let's really dig in and look at how it's impacting the behavior and talk about why you think it's a reinforcement or why you think it's a punishment. Again, those beliefs, those adult perspectives really affect fidelity and implementation. Also, a lot of people associate punishment and reinforcement with being mean or nice. And so some people really believe that when kids engage in challenging behaviors, us responding by being, quote, nice to kids by giving them a reinforcement isn't okay. And that goes back to some core beliefs they hold about kids and behavior and adult responses. And so when we can go in and address that and talk with them directly about it, it can really impact fidelity and implementation. That this isn't about being mean or nice, it's about really looking at what's effective at changing the behavior and how we put those pieces together to develop a good quality intervention plan. Before I go on to the next slide, I want to mention our next key phrase. That word is every. So when we are talking about punishment, again, it's a word we use all the time in our common language, but people who don't work in the behavior field don't often see some of those negative associations or risks that go along with using punishment as a strategy. Again, it's common. A kid does something wrong, they get grounded. A kid does something wrong, they get in trouble. They lose a privilege. They lose access to the TV or their technology. Since those are so common, we don't often think as adults who are not in the behavior field how that repeated application of a punisher can really impact kids. So again, taking time to sit down and talk with the adults about some of those risks related to punishment. So it only eliminates that problem behavior. It doesn't build skills. Very often teachers don't realize that. And once you talk with them about teaching as skill building and how reinforcement works to better build skills than punishment does, they can really dig into those beliefs about why they're using punishment versus why they're using reinforcement. So just because we eliminate one problem behavior, if the student doesn't have those skills, another problem behavior is going to spring up in their place. And when you talk with teachers about that, very often they can come up with examples of how that has happened with the student in the classroom. And once they can do that, they can be more willing to buy in to using reinforcement as a replacement strategy rather than continuing to rely on the punishment. Something else about punishment that we don't always talk with the teaching staff about is how it can impact a student's self-concept. So a lot of the students we work with challenging behavior have had repeated failures in their life. They're not successful with friends. They may not be successful academically. They don't have those connections. And that starts to impact how competent they see themselves. That starts to impact if they believe they can change. And so talking with teachers about that, about how it impacts kids and how we very often can't set up more punishers than the kids are already experiencing. Kids who are engaging in challenging behavior typically have more punishments in their life just naturally than other kids. And so we want to try to change those dynamics. And again, when you dig in and you ask teachers and parents, hey, what do you want for your child? How do you want them to see themselves? How can we build reinforcement systems or intervention systems that don't just change their behavior, but help them believe that a change is possible? And that goes along with that next point of helplessness and hopelessness. Um, Kids can give up if there are these negatives that they don't believe they can escape from. In addition to addressing adult beliefs, we need to address student beliefs. They also have to believe that change is possible to get them to buy in. So those are all things that as we are building these intervention systems, it's important to have some intentional conversations with the adults and even the kids when we're looking at using punishment as a tool. When we're looking at reinforcement as a tool, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Sometimes people can see reinforcement as just, oh, we're giving kids stuff, or we're doing this to be nice, or we just want everyone to earn something. And some of those foundational beliefs can make it so people are less likely to buy into reinforcement systems. And so understanding that the reason that we're using reinforcement systems is that we want to build skills. When kids have tools, they're less likely to engage in those problem behaviors. And very often our kids don't have multiple tools, and so we want to build those tools in the student's toolbox. Talking about, is it a skill deficit or a performance deficit? This is somewhere with teachers and parents. Again, sometimes they don't stop to ask that question. And it's something that we commonly evaluate when we're building the intervention system. But if the adults we're working with don't understand why sometimes we might do a task analysis or go into a teaching strategy rather than a reinforcement system, then they might not implement with fidelity. So when we can really break down for them some of those things that we inherently know, or some of those pieces we use to make decisions when we're building interventions, it can really help them understand that why more. And when they understand that why and they believe in that why, we're more likely to get to consistency and fidelity in implementation. Being prepared for extinction bursts. We know in behavior when we're doing change that it will get worse before it gets better. But that is not something we always prepare teachers and parents for. So talking about that is an expectation, why that is an expectation, how they will be prepared for that. So one of the pieces in Prochaska's stages of change is relapse. And that means this problem behavior is going to come back up. And that's not because the intervention isn't working. That's not because they've done something wrong. It's not because the child isn't trying. It's because that's a normal part of the change process. So the more that parents and teachers are prepared for that, they're prepared for there will be bumps in the road, the more they're going to be willing to continue the interventions, the less likely they are to get disheartened, because again, they're in this place because something about the intervention they were doing before hasn't worked. So it's not just kids that have a failure history, it's adults very often that have a failure history. And so the more we can talk about that and prepare them, okay, when it does get worse, why might that happen? What does that mean for our intervention? How are we going to have a planned response for that? All of those things are important in the intervention planning. Also, a lot of times we don't talk about satiation. Again, it's a technical behavior word. And so we don't necessarily discuss it with teachers and parents. But when we are building reinforcement systems, kids getting access to whatever they want on a regular basis can be a problem. And so when we are offering incentives, making sure that there's variety, helping the adults understand why that variety is important. One of the research studies I worked in early on, one of the reinforcers that we gave to kids was M&Ms, and there were a couple of kids who, man, they were on it. They got the right answer every time, and after about 10 minutes, all of a sudden they were putting up their hand and waving us off. They didn't want those M&Ms because they were full. And so when the adults who are working with kids don't understand some of those pieces, they can often think, oh, well, this system isn't working. And so if they know how reinforcement works and why some things may be a reinforcer for one student and not for another, or why we have to have that variability in reinforcement, or the rates of reinforcement need to be a lot more variable and change. Sometimes it needs to be high and standard. Sometimes it needs to be lower and variable. Again, we as professionals understand the subtleties of that change. And we may ask the adults implementing it to do those things, but if they don't understand the why, and if we don't get some buy-in on why those pieces of the plan are important, those are some of the small parts of an intervention plan that the adults might ignore because they don't understand that importance. And then as we are building these classroom systems, making sure that we really plan for every step in that change process. So those pre-contemplation, contemplation, determination stages, and then some of those later stages, relapse. Again, as I said on the last slide, relapse is part of change. Behaviors are going to come back for a whole variety of reasons. And so adults being prepared for that relapse process is an important part of the change system. And then maintenance and generalization. Again, so often our plans are focused on addressing this challenging behavior that is dangerous to the students or dangerous to other people. But thinking, how are we going to generalize this behavior beyond just the one person who's implementing the plan? We see this a lot in classrooms where there's one teacher or one staff member who can implement this plan, but if they're absent or they're gone, then the whole plan falls apart. And so from the beginning, thinking about, okay, how are we going to generalize this so that anyone can implement that plan? And then how are we going to maintain that change over time? What's going to be those next steps? Again, so often we dig into that critical start point of that action step, and then we don't have a plan for those next steps. As I mentioned, as we are starting that intervention process, really digging into those beliefs and continuing to reflect on those beliefs. So it's not something that we can just talk about one time. It's something that if we're going to change someone's belief or get them to understand and buy into what we believe, that's going to take regular discussions and reflection. And so building in that reflection time as part of your consultation is really important. And taking that time to have the definitions and build a common language. One of the ways to really get people to examine their beliefs is to look at the choices they made in an intervention. So I see that you reinforced this way, or I see that we went back to removing the student's device. We talked about why reinforcement is more effective, but it looks like you were doing things this other way. Can you tell me a little bit more about that why? Can you help me understand why you made that choice in the moment? To really get them thinking about their why, we want them to be intentional in their choices. And this isn't something I do just because I believe kids should act this way, or this isn't something I do because I believe in general this is how I should respond to behavior. It's because this is an effective intervention with this student. This follows the principles of reinforcement or punishment, so that we really have that bigger common language that we can use to make sure that as we're discussing these interventions, that we are all on the same page.
Dr. Scher, I'm going to interrupt right
Yep,
there and feed you a question. And I think a lot of that
sure.
reflecting and the why goes into this. And this is kind of a tricky one. But Jessica asked if the adult is clearly not ready to change their behavior, but okay, oops, it just jumped because there's another question. um, so if the adult is clearly not ready to change their behavior, but the student behavior is significantly unsafe, how do we quickly get the adult being ready to change in that situation?
And so that is where a combination of, I love motivational interviewing as a strategy, and there are some phenomenal resources out there. There are some motivational interviewing questioning strategies that I think are pretty effective at helping people to buy in, and get some of those initial pieces of change. Also, in those situations where you've got some dangerous behavior, often this has to be paired with some modeling.
Mhm.
And so, for them really to get to buy in, they have to see those strategies so that they can understand their effectiveness. Because a lot of times, when teachers are really dug in like that, they don't really believe that change is possible. And they believe that they are already doing all of the things. And so, someone coming in and really demonstrating what the strategies look like and how they might be different can help address safety in the moment, but can also really demonstrate some of those differences. And then after that, spending some time on those reflection questions with the teacher. What did you see different? What did you see that was effective? Having them focus in on the student's response as well as the adult's behavior can really be helpful. And it's not an easy thing to do. Getting people to buy in when there's a safety concern at the same time is definitely a challenge.
Mhm. Thank you. That was it for now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Were there any other questions? Because I was just gonna wrap up and
I do.
um,
I actually did just get one in the Q&A. So this one
okay.
says, the child has mouthing, sensory seeking through repetitive movements using legs and hands and jumping. In this situation, what is the intervention that could be used? So, I'll just say out here, we have to be careful with answering things like this because
Yeah,
there's so many different variables. We don't have the data, we don't know the environment and
yeah.
all of that. But if you want to add anything to that, Jill, I'll let you.
Yes. Yes, and that's where it kind of as my wrap up. In addition to, so I focused a lot on the consequence strategies today, and talking about reinforcement and punishment because again, those are terms we use in our common day-to-day language that we as behavior specialists have a very different definition for than the people we're working with. But those are by far not the only strategies. I will say that some of my best, most effective interventions have been done in partnership with both speech and language therapists and occupational therapists to make sure that we are building in those sensory pieces and that we are meeting those sensory needs. Again, I am not a specialist in occupational therapy, but the occupational therapists I've worked with have spotted things as unmet sensory needs that I, as a psychologist or a behavior therapist, would have attributed to a learning strategy, a skill deficit, or reinforcement contingencies. And so really digging into sensory needs, and getting a professional lens on those sensory pieces is so important. And it's something that I didn't realize fully how many small things could be based in a sensory need, until I started working with some occupational therapists who are also trained in behavior.
Hey, I think that's everything. There's also, she loved, if you have any favorite motivational interviewing tools, if you want to share those with me, I could maybe link them into, I'll send an email to the registrants afterwards if you've got any.
Yes, yes, there are a couple. I don't have them at my fingertips. I should have had them as a reference, but there are a couple. There's a practitioner series with Guilford, and they've done a couple on motivational interviewing with students. And so they've got some great scripts and examples because sometimes we're trying to get kids to buy into the motivation for change. And if adults don't see the problem, man, kids really don't see themselves as the problem. They see everyone else as the problem. And then there's another book that really digs into using motivational interviewing in consultation, in school-based consultation. And so there's some awesome, like I said, scripts and checklists and things in those books that I can absolutely share. Are there any other questions? I was trying to um, pace myself to give us a little more time at the end. Um,
Yes, and I will. I'm just gonna, sorry, interrupt one more time. I
yeah,
see a lot of
no,
questions coming in now that are pretty specific. And
okay,
we do have to be careful, like I said, with that because
yeah,
there is a lot of other information and variables that we don't know. So we will kind of just make sure that the questions are a little bit more general, and about the presentation, and we're happy to take time for those. But anything very specific with a particular learner, we're probably not going to be able to give you the best feedback with just the short amount of time we have.
yes, yes, and there are so many different factors that influence that behavior in very subtle ways. So this is definitely some big picture pieces when doing that consultation and intervention planning. So the final takeaways, and I've mentioned this, are taking that time to really reflect and make sure we're clear on our why. Again, a lot of our choices and our interventions are driven by those learning principles and those behavior pieces, but those certainly aren't the only things that impact students. We know that communication pieces, and like I said, having a speech language therapist come in and discuss some of those communication pieces can really help build a more robust intervention, always looking at those sensory pieces. So as we're looking at the functions of behavior and digging into the why behind students who are engaging in behavior, always considering those sensory and movement needs. So often we have these expectations and, again, beliefs about what a student should do or what a behavior should look like, and and that's just not what behavior looks like for all kids. And so when we look at what are these unmet sensory needs, when we look at what is that student trying to communicate, so we say behavior is communication, but then we'll come back and say, well, why is this student doing this? So taking that time to really think about, even us as professionals, how do I apply those interventions when I'm, or those beliefs when I'm building interventions?
Awesome. Is that everything, Jill?
I think that's everything I had.
If you don't mind stopping your screen share,
Not at
you go.
all.
Okay, so everyone, the last keyword is learner. I will put that there, and then our form is right there. And I'm going to pull up one last thing. And we've got our questions and our social media on here. So the last keyword is learner. If you want to learn more, you can check out our website and book a demo to see how our platform can help you. You can also connect with us on social media and stay up to date with our latest webinars and free resources. Our webinar next month, we're going to have Dr. Copland, who is a developmental pediatrician and a BCBA that will be providing our CEU. So that will be posted soon. And also, please don't forget to complete the form in the chat to earn your CEU. And thank you so much, Dr. Shearer, for being here with us today. This was just such an important conversation. And I think, especially for the BCBAs that are in the room, sometimes we can get focused and want to move a little too fast. And it's just really important to get back to that foundation and build that rapport and that trust with the people that are often implementing the plans that are going to be
Mhm.
making the change. So
Yeah.
I think this is just such fabulous information for everyone to hear, and I'd love for them to, share it with their teams also if there's other people. So if there are any other questions, I will let me move the chat over here. Just see some thank yous there, but I will be on for just a minute if you need anything. And then, of course, you can also email me at amy@hirasmus.com if there's any questions. But thank you all so much for joining us to learn and grow together. And I hope everybody has a fabulous day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.